Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Solid State Gamer Proto Watch. I'm your host, John Rivera, lead reviewer for the site, as well as host of the ROMcast. And this time around, we're going to be taking an interesting look at a Super Nintendo prototype, which is properly titled X, and is also known as SNESGlider. And this game has a really interesting history, and it's actually pretty ambitious for what it is. This game is actually a fully 3D polygonal tank combat video game prototype, and it was meant to showcase basically the 3D engine that Argonaut Software had concocted for the Super Nintendo hardware. And the most interesting thing about this game, in my opinion at least, is the fact that this game does not use the Super FX chip. This is pre-Super FX. In fact, this prototype is circa 1991 in its existence. And the reason why that is really interesting is because this game was actually the game that essentially Dylan Cuthbert and Jez Sand of Argonaut Software presented to Nintendo after coming off the heels of the release of X, or X, for the Japan Game Boy. And that was a tank combat game, much like this tech demo is. And admittedly, this engine is pretty much a revamped version of the X Commander engine, being retrofitted to use flat shaded polygons as opposed to wireframe 3D polygons. So this is actually a huge step up for their 3D efforts. And this tech demo is actually made intentionally to provoke Nintendo to give them the time and money to develop what we now know as the Super FX microchip family. And the Super FX chip is in every single 3D polygonal Super Nintendo game. You think about Vortex, Star Fox, Super Mario Land 2, Yoshi's Island, Dirt Tracks FX, Doom, Stunt Race FX. All these games are Super FX games and feature 3D polygonal graphics. And this game is interesting because it does not. And the reason why it does not is, again, Jez Sand and Dylan Cuthbert intentionally made this. As you can see, this game does not function all that well. You know, the frame rate varies. It runs the gamut from smooth to slow to, oh my god, this is slow. And also, you know, you could tell that the environments don't look aesthetically terribly pleasing. They look like they were just basically placeholders that were carryovers from the SNESGlider games, a game series that Jez Sand and Dylan Cuthbert were experimenting with in terms of 3D graphics in home computer stratosphere. Specifically, the Commodore 64 was a platform where SNESGlider graced, and it graced other home computer platforms at that time. But the C64 versions are the only ones I can think of at this moment. Anyway, so let's take you through a tour of this little tech demo. It might look like I'm sucking really hard at this, but the control agency of this game is actually not all that great. It's kind of confusing. It's not very intuitive, and as I'm getting shot at by some of these tanks. But here, let me actually, instead of shooting these obstacles or whatever, let me get this control agency explanation out of the way so that way you guys can understand how this works. So basically, right now I'm in tank mode. Actually, let's look at the view screen elements as well as the heads-up display elements. As you can see at the lower center part of the screen proper, you have these dots moving around. This is actually a dynamic radar screen, and all this is a 3D projection. These elements on the radar, they're actually 3D projections that exist in some sort of simulated 3D space that dynamically refresh. Actually, a really interesting feature when you think about it. It actually adds to the performance hit of this X prototype. As you can see on the view screen, we have basically some text on video elements. We have the tank over there. It indicates which vehicular mode I'm in. There are two modes in this game. There's a walker mode and a tank mode, which can be accessed and toggled between at will by pressing start. And the control agency for both vehicles is different, to say the least. So let me get into that. Pressing X and B will make your tank move forward and backpedal, respectively. Left and right on the D-pad actually controls where your tank tracks are turning, and they turn independent of the turret, as you can see, because I'm moving both of them independent of one another. Now L and R actually turns the tank turret left and right, respectively. And aiming up and down, which is kind of confusing, is achieved by pressing up and down on the D-pad. Why they made the tank turret controls half on the D-pad and half on the shoulder buttons is anybody's guess. I guess that's what they thought was the most optimal control scheme at the time. But honestly, it's not really that optimal. Anyway, as you can see, where my tank tracks are facing are represented by this vertical white bar that's moving to the right now. So they do have some heads-up display elements that actually helps you to really get a handle on, where how your tank is maneuvering in 3D space. So they did everything they could. So that's actually pretty interesting. You can fire lasers by pressing the Y button, and you can fire concussion missiles by pressing the A button. Now you can hear that I'm pressing this. It's not really it's not really one-to-one, and it's because the frame rate is so low that it's actually impacting the control agency of the game. Now, obviously, in terms of today's standards, that's pretty much unacceptable, but this was the Wild Wild West, and pretty much the standards were pretty low in terms of, I guess, frame rate optimization and draw distance and things of that nature. I mean, this was pretty much the Stone Age of 3D, and this prototype, I believe, was constructed and presented in 1991. I think that's the timestamp that can be placed on this prototype, circa 1991. I can't give you an exact date because I've yet to find it in the hexadecimal code of this game's file. But yeah, we'll have to settle for 1991. I wish I had an exact date for my book. But so that's how you pilot the tank. Now the walker is a little more wonky. Let's actually get these satellite dishes out of the way so that way it's smoother. So you actually direct where you aim by pressing the D-pad, but this also ties into how you rotate the mech walker left and right. Once you hit a threshold point on the left, which is right here, then your walker will start rotating left, and vice versa for the right side. So the cursor itself has to move over to that threshold to allow your mech walker to then rotate left and right. It's a weird movement system. I don't know why it's like that, but I guess they decided that it had to be different. Anyway, you can aim up and down to a point. Unfortunately, where your reticle is not where your lasers will fire. They will still fire towards the green reticle right here, which I originally thought was to, I guess, circumvent some sort of disorientation with the 3D. I'm not sure why it was put there, but I assume it was put there just as a general aid, visual aid to see where your lasers would fire. Who knows? Because this reticle that is moving right now is the reticle for the tank, and that's where the lasers will fire. But then again, that's always at the center of the screen, so I don't know. There's just some weird thing going on with that. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. The same thing as the tank mode. Y will fire lasers. Actually, just like Star Fox, so that's kind of telling. The creative line of DNA between this prototype and what we now know as being Star Fox for the Super Nintendo. Pressing the A button will fire these huge, I guess, laser torpedoes. I guess that is apt. But you can tell as soon as it's fired, the frame rate takes a dive because these are fully 3D polygonal entities, and as you know, as opposed to the lasers the lasers are actually 2D projections. These are actually not polygonal entities. These, on the other hand, are. And because there's so many of them flooding the screen, and when you fire the laser, it's 1-to-1. One press indicates one laser being shot, or one pair of lasers being shot. That's not the case when you fire the laser torpedoes. You can actually hold down the button, and it perpetually just automatically rapid fires all these torpedoes all over the place. And you got some interesting explosion effects here. Let me see if I can shoot down the ground so you can see that. You can see the radar is just flooded with all these, because anything that is considered a 3D entity registers as an object on the radar, whether it's a projectile or an enemy or just a piece of the object, a piece of object in the environment. And the lowering of the frame rate actually does dramatically impact the control agency input. Let's actually fire a bunch, and then I'm going to press down the laser button right now. You see how bad the delay was in that? That was, I mean, for most games that'd be unacceptable. Last thing to talk about with the walker mode is that strafing is accomplished by pressing L and R respectively for those directions left and right. The walker mode is not really ideal for combat in this prototype. It's actually more ideal to control the tank. You just have more mobility, you have more control over where your lasers go and where your missiles are going. These satellite dish installations can actually be destroyed. And so can the tanks as well. And if you see how they explode, they become wireframe polygons, and as they disperse into the air and disappear, that's actually a lot like the Prototype X, or not the Prototype X, but the Game Boy game X. There's actually a very solid chronological and developmental connection between SNESGlider X, this prototype, and the Super Nintendo games Star Fox and Stunt Race FX, and also Vortex to a limited extent. The reason why this prototype is so important in its existence was that had this prototype not been constructed and presented to the folks at Nintendo, I dare say that the money and time allocated towards the development of the Super Effects microchip would never have happened. Because they basically showed this tech demo not just for all of its splendor and wonder, but also to show its shortcomings. I mean, honestly, the control agency is so limited by the frame rate. And admittedly, when Jez Sand and Dylan Cuthbert of Argonaut Software showed this to Nintendo, they basically said, look, this is pretty cool stuff that we've been able to come up with, but this is as good as it's going to get. I mean, it can't get any better than this on standard Super Nintendo hardware. Now, if you permitted us to actually create a microprocessor for the Super Nintendo to facilitate the rendering of the flat shaded polygonal graphics that you see here, we'd be able to make a fully fledged game with more objects, more entities, more effects, just more everything, more pizzazz than what you see right here, because this, like I said, this is as good as it'll get. Now, the folks at Nintendo, they basically said, no, we're not going to allow you guys to change the hardware specifications of the Super Nintendo, because this was 1991. I have to assume it was early 1991, because the Super Nintendo was basically released during that year, and there was no way that they were going to change the hardware specs of the console months before it needed to come out, because the Sega Genesis had a 2-year lead on the Super Nintendo. You know, they had to get this thing out so that way they could compete on Sega's level graphically. So they basically said, no, we're not doing that. Super Nintendo specs are staying the way they are. We need to put this thing out. But if you guys want to develop a microprocessor, if you guys can make it work for every single game, we will give you the time and money to develop such hardware, such graphical hardware assistance necessary to make this a reality. And that's what begot the Super Effects microchip. So that's the reason why this tech demo or this prototype is very important, because without it, the SuperFX microchip and Star Fox, I dare say Star Fox, would not have existed. So, but as a game by itself, it's not terribly exciting. I mean, there's no music, there's no sound. You guys might have noticed that right off the bat. You know, the backgrounds, as you can see right here, we have these little mountains and a random tree. You know, not terribly exciting to look at, but, and I dare say that this little mission area does not really have a beginning or an end. You can actually travel on for infinity, which is actually pretty interesting, but at the same time doesn't really add anything to what's going on because the environment is so scant. I mean, look, I've driven for almost half a minute and you can't really see anything in the distance except for those pieces of placeholder scenery. But this game is important. It's important that this prototype existed because, like I said, without the existence of this and this being presented to the folks at Nintendo, the research and development that went into the SuperFX microchip would not have happened. And without the SuperFX microchip, games like Star Fox, Stunt Race FX, Vortex, Dirt Tracks FX, Doom, and other such games would not have been possible. You know, and Star Fox is one of my favorite games, and to think that this prototype was the thing that set the gears in motion for Star Fox creation is... it's pretty crazy to think. So, you know, because of that, I have a lot of respect for what this prototype is and what it represents, warts and all. It's not perfect. It doesn't function that well, but that was the point. You know, the point was for them to show how inadequate the hardware was to facilitate such graphics like these. And it was impressive enough, but telling enough, which is a very tricky balance to achieve, for it to show the wonder and the possibilities while showing the limitations, and having that being able to propel and set the gears in motion for what Argonaut would have done with the SuperFX chip, as well as their software like Star Fox and Stunt Race FX and so on. You know, that's a very special thing to achieve, and it's kind of a thing in the annals of gaming history that you don't really see that often, where a big company like Nintendo is willing to take a chance on burgeoning technology. Because, you know, in the past they've always been in the case of, well, we're going to take technology that is retro accessible and we're going to improve on it and we're going to make software for it because people know how to develop for it. And that's always been their philosophy. You look at the NES and you look at the Game Boy, it's the case with those. In fact, the Super Nintendo was the only system that was technologically superior to its competition. And then some other people would say the N64 was another case of that, but it's such a hamstrung hardware architecture for the Nintendo 64 that the fact that it's got a Silicon Graphics GPU is moot, because it's only got 4K texture memory, and, you know, it had blur vision graphics because the texture memory was so low that everything just kind of looked blurry. It's kind of a shame. But I digress. Let's get on with the rest of the demo. This is actually a shape demo that is accessed by pressing select, and this is pretty much a point of no return, because once I press select, you cannot get out of the shape demo. So this is pretty much going to close out this video. So pressing select subsequent times can access new polygonal models, and as you can see, these models are not these models aren't available in the prototype. There's only basically a few models that are. This model's not. Actually, if you press A, it'll recenter it. This is the laser cannon that the walker fires. These are the tanks that you pilot and fight against. This is actually not even in the demo. Neither is this, or this plane. Actually, this plane, believe it or not, looks like it's a carryover from the NESGlider games. Interesting. But anyway, yeah, that's definitely not in there. Anyway, that's pretty much going to do it for this episode of Proto Watch. I hope you guys enjoyed my little tour, my guided tour of X, aka SNESGlider for the Super Nintendo. And hope you guys got a little bit out of it in terms of filling in some gaps about the progression of 3D in games, as well as the history of Star Fox and Star Fox 2 and all the other Super Effects family of games. It's actually really fascinating to see this. When I finally got my hands on this prototype, it all made sense in terms of my understanding of the history of Star Fox 2, because I am kind of writing a book on it, and this is just another piece in that puzzle that fits perfectly well and really does tell you this. It helps you to tell the story and understand the story of how Star Fox 2 came to be, its development and its tragic cancellation. So again, this is a very important piece of history, and without this, honestly, where 3D games are right now, honestly, probably would have taken a few more years to accomplish. We wouldn't have, the gaming experiences that we have in 3D nowadays, had it not been for tech demos like this and other stuff that id Software was doing and Sega AM2 was doing, I dare say that it would have taken us much longer to get to where we are now in terms of modern 3D graphics in gaming, and also 3D game design. The notion of camera, the notion of polygonal collision and stuff like that, just the very, draw distance, all these features that are now tenets and part of the core of competent 3D game design would have taken longer to achieve had it not been for little tech demos like this that were pretty much experimental. So anyway, that concludes this episode of Proto Watch. As always, I'm your host, John Rivera, saying thank you guys for watching. If you guys have any suggestions or comments, you just want to drop some feedback on top of us, be sure to comment below this video. Be sure to subscribe. We're planning on doing some more interesting videos on stuff that you might not have seen in gaming, period, or stuff that you might have an inkling as to what it is, but aren't really sure as to what it is, and you need some gaps filled in your knowledge. And if you guys just want to learn new stuff about the history of games with what I do hands-on with them, be sure to subscribe and give your suggestions. If you guys know about any video game prototypes that I've yet to cover, maybe I have them in my possession, maybe I don't, and maybe need to be directed to a place where I can download it and figure out how to get it working on hardware, because that's really how I try to do these things. Be sure to let me know in the comments section below, and just general feedback. We're a very very small site. We're not very popular right now, but maybe that'll change, and we want to be not just a repository for gaming information in terms of news and current events and stuff and modern games coverage, but we also want to, actually start to become a repository of information on the history of games, and this is kind of a step in that direction. So, for those of you looking to just be entertained with sophomoric humor, this is not the place for you. But if you want to be educated on different annals and different cul-de-sacs in the history of video games, this is for you. So this is merely meant to be informational, not just for sheer entertainment. But anyway, that'll do it for this episode, and again, thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and as always, I'll see you guys next time around.